I'm Lise Regula, and I'm here today to speak a little bit about threats to our democracy. For those who don't know me, I am a graduate of Kent State University, currently teaching at University of Dayton while living in Columbus, Ohio. My husband MJ Eckhouse and I moved to Columbus, Ohio after living in Kent for an extended period of time, and while we were there, both were civically and politically engaged, helping to pass the non-discrimination ordinance, conversion therapy ban, and in 2018 I ran for Portage County Auditor. Now, my good friend Richard Stegman Gall still lives in Kent and still teaches at Kent State University in the history department. His research area is Germany just immediately pre-World War II. Specifically, he studies fascism. And he has asserted for a number of years now that the US is creeping towards fascism, and he does that not to start an argument, though it often does. But he does this instead to point out that our democracy is under attack through a number of threats. Some of those that he lists are secrecy in government, money in government, exclusionary practices and limitations to the exercise of our rights, as well as, most recently, the devaluing of the truth and expertise, and instead uplifting of ignorance and disinformation. That last one is the most recent, and we saw the most egregious examples under the Trump administration, especially with regard to the pandemic and COVID-19. Because it is more recent, it is more likely easier to turn the tide on that one. Those other three, or of those other three, I'm going to be addressing that issue of limitations of exercise of rights. The first two, I'm going to exercise my right of the teacher hat and give you a homework assignment, no pop quiz involved. And when you go home today, or while you're on your computer now, look up a couple of things. In order to better understand some of the secrecy at work within our democratic processes and threatening our democratic processes, I want you to look up Doubletree Suites 2011 redistricting. That was a hotel room where maps were drawn in 2011, and it helps to explain how we got to the gerrymandered state that we are today. And it also points out some of the lessons that we should take away as we are currently undergoing another round of redistricting process. We are still waiting on census data, and we are still waiting for the governor to convene the redistricting commission. So this is a fight that is beginning anew, but understanding that year and those events might help as we get engaged this year. The second thing is not dealing with secrecy, but instead money in politics. And for that, your homework is to Google HB6 FBI investigation. This is the 2019 bill that hamstrung renewable energy in favor of funneling money towards the fossil and nuclear industry instead. This is in part a result of the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision that ruled money equals speech in politics. If you have any questions about those or would just love to emotionally process some of that information after you find it, feel free to give me a call or email me. I am more than happy to talk with budding activists about these things. That last, third threat to democracy is where I want to spend more time. The limitation of exercise of rights in the US is something that we are seeing in Ohio and other states actively. This can look like limitation of polling places, polling times, and absentee ballot access. That's what we tend to see happening in Ohio, and those tend to be the more egregious limitations of right to the vote. We can look at redlining and geographic racism and poll taxes and poll tests and see how limiting access to polls is a problem and a threat to our democracy. Voter ID laws, the often seen as more respectable or more reasonable limitation of right to the vote, is not something that we're seeing as much in Ohio, but it is something that I have experience with. I sit here in front of you, a white, landowning, well-educated, reasonably well-to-do man. By all accounts, I should be able to vote across all of the nation's history, for better or worse. That is the status that I find myself in. I have a lot of privilege. I also sit here in front of you as a trans man. And as a trans man, in order for me to have an ID that matches who I am legally and who you see in front of me, I had to shell out about $500, as well as countless administrative hours for things like legal name change, updating my birth certificate, which is still in process, updating my passport, my driver's license, my social security records. Now, I sit here not to say, oh, woe is me, poor little white boy, but instead to say, with all of my privilege, if these are the obstacles that I faced in voting and exercising that fundamental right, imagine what the obstacles might be for someone in a worse off position, a trans woman, a single mom of color, a person in active addiction, a felon recently released on parole. All of these people are going to have more difficulty accessing their right to the vote than me under many voter ID laws. There's a purpose to that. It's a threat to democracy. Now, other limitations to, or other threats to democracy include additional things that are going on in Ohio today and are things that we can also fight back against. And those include the limitation of our exercise of free speech and exercising our right to protest. There are currently in the Ohio State House bills under consideration that would do just that, including making it a criminal offense to mentally interfere with a police officer. Those are threats to our democracy. By limiting or criminalizing the exercise of free speech, what we are doing is making it harder for people who are already facing a stacked system to have their voice heard. Luckily, and this is where I'm going to end up, luckily, we have seen people exercising those rights more frequently. Ever since last year in the George Floyd murder, we have been seeing people coming out in droves, not just against police violence, but standing up in general for our democracy. And this is where I want to end on a high note, because yes, I have covered a lot of threats. Those threats are a response to the realization that those in power who want to keep a stacked system in place are losing. They are losing in the demographic numbers. They are losing in the polls. They are becoming obsolete. And if we keep pushing, there are more of us who value social justice, who value community, who value others than there are of them. And so long as we fight, and so long as we continue to do the next right thing, I have hope, because the times they are a-changin'.